In this discussion, we are going to talk about the caste system as it was perceived by the British rulers, more prominently from the second half of the 19th century, but already in the early part of the century, certain ideas about the caste system had already been formed in the minds of the British rulers. Some of these rulers were also scholar officials who had a genuine curiosity about the society over which they were ruling. But as we shall see towards the concluding part of this discussion, that it was not intellectual curiosity alone that had created this interest in caste, because caste represented the basic fragmentation of Indian society into numerous small communities who had an acute consciousness of their distinctive exclusive identity, something which was, at least theoretically, antithetical towards the idea of a nation. So it is not intellectual curiosity alone that was actually inspiring these officials to analyze the caste system in the manner they did, but there was a kind of political intention behind it. So when you come to the census operations, you see it ultimately emerging as the motives became very clear. So this is basically the question we are trying to address in this discussion. Now, the British perception about the caste system in India evolved through stages. The early British observers, whether they were officials or non-officials, scholars or missionaries, they understood the caste system in terms of the original Brahminical textual classification in terms of varnas. So you may remember that famous passage in Bhagavad Gita where the God, Krishna, proclaiming that it is I who have created the four varnas, Choturvarnang maya srishtang guna karma vibhagasha. I have divided society into four varnas depending on the quality of each of these varnas. The Brahmins were expected to teach, to cultivate knowledge. The Kshatriyas were the warrior castes. The Vaishyas were traders, and the Shudras were agriculturists and servants. So James Mill suggested that the varna classification was one of the earliest Brahminical statement about division of labor. But varna was not an adequate classification, although shastric, although sanctioned by Brahminical textual knowledge, on which basis the early British Orientalist scholars were looking upon caste as a continuation of that ancient varna system. Varna was overlaid by a more complex system known as the jati system.
Sir, how did the Europeans come to term with such a large number of jati system?
Yes, because this is an important question to the degree that coming to terms with the jati system is basically moving away from the more simplistic but shastric varna classification. In actuality, varna became less relevant than jati, because we have enough historical evidence of how a man from an inferior caste in a traditional society could rise up in caste hierarchy or in ritual hierarchy. We know that in Bengal, during the rule of the Senas, the Brahmins were given so much of eminence and power than in earlier times. when the Brahmins were not so powerful. So the jati system was more open. You do not have this rigid classification. You have the open frontiers where one group of people would enter into another group or would claim superior status or would rise up in the ritual hierarchy. For example, you have this evidence of the Brahta Kshatriyas. Kshatriyas who eventually were the originators of the Rajputs, for example, people who came from outside India, but then they were assimilated within the caste system with this designation of Brahta Kshatriyas. Eventually, it was from their ranks that the latter-day Rajputs emerged. So it was important for the British to conduct empirical service in order to get a better sense of what the caste system was when you are looking at caste as a jati, not as a varna. Because the Brahmins themselves were subdivided into smaller groups. The Vaishyas were divided into so many trading castes, and each of these castes followed the strict rule of endogamy, which is basically marrying within the caste. I mean, the Suvarna Boniks in Bengal, Gandha Boniks in Bengal, these can be classified as members of the Vaishya Varna, but when you look at the manner in which these people live their lives, they are identifying themselves with a particular endogamous group called jati. So, to look at the Indian situation or to understand the Indian caste system demanded empirical service, and such empirical service became more extensive from the latter half of the 19th century.
So how did the pre-colonial rulers perceive the caste system?
I have given you this example of Balal Sen, that some of these rulers who were very deliberately promoting the Brahmins as the ideological leaders of Indian society, they would offer them land grants, they would ask them to reclaim new territories, new land, settle Shudra cultivators, establish the preeminence and the legitimacy of the Brahminical social order, and in the Brahminical social order, caste is extremely important. So you have one kind of perception in the ancient times when the Brahminical social order was being created. But even in medieval times, if you look at the observations of some travelers, I mean, this pre-colonial thinking concerns both the rulers who are accepting or rejecting the caste system. There may be instances of how in a local society a ruler who doesn't belong to an upper caste, to Kshatriya order, or to who is not a Brahmin, who is coming up from a small lower caste, would not be so respectful about the caste system or the Varna system. So, but once the Brahminical social order gained some acceptance and achieved ideological dominance, ideological hegemony, the purity pollution criterion became the defining element in the Varna system, and it continued to define the basic structure of the caste system or the jati system as well. Those whose presence will pollute a Brahmin would actually occupy a very low position in the caste hierarchy, and they will be found to be members of performing menial occupation. Those who are not polluting would be ranked at the higher levels and would be participating in trades or in crafts or in occupations which are more respectable. So there is an element of connection with what we may describe as the occupational division of society understood in terms of caste. For example, many foreign travelers or traders came to Indian ports and found jati-like structures among trading classes. Traders, they looked upon these jatis as guilds, the guilds that they found in their own country, guilds of trading groups. But the Indian terminology that was in use and on which they superimposed their understanding of caste was jati. Al-Biruni, for example, talked about this purity pollution criterion. Abul Fazl's Akbarnama, you have similar references about how there is the division of Indian society or Hindu society in terms of castes and such groups whose hierarchy or whose position in the caste hierarchy was determined by the purity pollution criterion. So it is not as if that caste was an European invention. Caste existed, but the Indian terminology is either Varna, which is more wide, less accurate, or Jati, which is more specific, which concentrates on empirical observation to find out what was the caste system as it operated on the ground, how there were numerous Jati divisions. For example, the term caste is a European nomenclature superimposed on Indian society. It is derived from the term casta. The Portuguese settlers in Latin America used this term casta in order to distinguish themselves from the indigenous settlers. So the term casta, which implied hierarchy, ultimately is employed by the Europeans as a method to understand the hierarchical division of Indian society into different groups, some of which groups were superior, some of which were inferior, and superiority and inferiority, which was articulated through the purity pollution criterion, might have been determined by their occupation as well. So this is the reason why in the later half of the 19th century, greater emphasis was put on empirical surveys about the caste system, but in a larger context. In the larger context where ethnology was emerging as a very important discipline. Ethnological research became very popular in Europe, partly because of nationalism. Because nationalism persuaded thinkers to explore the ethnological and ethnic origin of different nationalities, different nations in Europe. So each of these nations was actually looking for their ethnological basis, some kind of unity that could be deciphered from the ethnic unity, and this was the job of the ethnologist. But for the same reason, ethnology was important in propping up the imperial hegemony, because once you begin to classify and then you introduce the purity pollution criterion in terms of superior and inferior races, then the superiority of the race becomes a justification for empire. So this is another dimension of ethnology. But ethnology began to be used by a man like Herbert Risley in understanding the caste system. Risley for some time was a census commissioner, and he offered a kind of racial interpretation.
Sir, how did Howard Risley use the ethnological principles to understand this caste system?
Yes, Risley's ethnological principles were determined by the Aryan-Dravidian divide. In Indian society, he found three racial types: the Mongoloid, the Dravidian, and the Aryan. And out of these primeval original stocks, different castes emerged. Risley at the same time suggested that over time there was a possibility of contamination or racial intermingling. Now, how do you measure it? That was, of course, the question. So he introduced a very interesting, absurd of course, but interesting method of anthropometry. In order to distinguish a non-Aryan, a man of non-Aryan origin from a man of Aryan origin, measurements began to be taken of the size of the nose or the size of the skull, the color of the skin. A man who has an aquiline nose must be a descendant of the glorious Aryans. A man with a blunted nose, dark-skinned, they must have emerged from the non-Aryan stock. Now, keeping this in mind, Risley went a step forward by asking people to verify how men who are not adequately Brahmanized, men who belong to tribal groups, would invariably give you this kind of an impression of a dark-skinned, blunt-nosed person. A man belonging to an inferior caste, in terms of this anthropometric principles, would be less fair-skinned, wouldn't have a sharp nose. Now, you can understand the absurdity of these methods. But even if these methods were absurd, this was claimed as a science by an ethnologist like Risley, who understood or who tried to understand the caste system in terms of the racial division of Indian society. Even though a man who generally followed Risley but then qualified his statement by putting greater stress on the possibility of so much of racial intermingling that the original physical features of the Brahmin might have been lost in a region like Bengal. So Hunter, who wrote this statistical account of Bengal, was of the opinion that as the Aryans migrated into the frontier regions, to the peripheral regions, beyond Aryavarta, and mingled with the local population, the aboriginal population, this kind of racial intermingling produced a system which did not carry on with that old divide between the Aryans and the non-Aryans. So the Varna came to India because of the deliberate attempt by the Aryans to divide or to isolate themselves from the aboriginals in order to establish their ritual superiority, claiming superior status, ensurfing the original settlers and then integrating them into the caste system by giving them the level of the Shudra. The Shudra was a cultivator, and many of these Shudras were original people who had been living in India, and once the Aryans conquered the land, they were converted to Shudra status. They were given this Shudra status in order to establish the ritual and the political domination of the Aryan settlers. Aryans took women from Aboriginal society, and as they began to marry into a local society, you have a new formation emerging where the groundwork of the jati system was created. So you have many jatis which are called Sankara jatis, mixed jatis. The racial theory of the caste was therefore questioned, challenged by another set of officials who looked at regions where the Brahmins were not dominant. Even if they were ritually pure, they were poor, they were not powerful. In Punjab, in northwestern India, where you have Jat brotherhoods exercising dominance in the society over the ritually pure Brahmins. In such situations, the ritual classification which is derived from the Shastras, which was accepted by the early British rulers as the basic foundation of the caste system, was not relevant at all. The logic of power dictated something else. And when they empirically surveyed such situations, they came up with the idea which is more close, which is closer to the jati system that as it existed on the ground, that jatis are tied with occupation. And that is the reason why, as civilization progressed, as society progressed, social groups began to proliferate, depending on specialization, depending on the proliferation of trade, proliferation of crafts. You have this complex jati system Now, whether it is Varna or Jati, eventually the idea that the European observers tried to parade, starting from the early 19th century, was that in India, the individual doesn't exist. So, there was no possibility of an individual taking initiative to establish his identity as an individual. An individual is so much a part of a group or a jati that his life is controlled by the norms practiced by the jati. He has to accept the endogamous principles of the jati system. The fact that it is not so irrelevant is even, you can see even today, that there are ritual killings because somebody wishes to marry outside the jati. There is some sense in the argument that an individual became bogged down, or the individual becomes so much a prisoner of the jati system that he doesn't have an individual identity of his own beyond, outside the rubric of the jati system. So that was one of the main contentions, apart from the theory that Indian society was so divided ethnologically that it was difficult to visualize it as a nation. This particular dimension, which emphasizes the link with occupation, came from a group of ethnologists like Denzil Ibbetson, who worked on Punjab, or you have William Crook, a few others who questioned the principle of racial classification, even though they accepted that jati was the defining thing in the life of an Indian. And this becomes clear when we look at the extensive reportage and surveys in the later half of the 19th century. You have Hunter's statistical account, you have Risley's Tribes and Caste of Bengal, you have similar Tribes and Caste and Caste volume for other regions as well. So you have an extensive ethnological reportage about the Indian caste system synchronizing with the census.
So don't you think that the census had an important role to play in the classification of Indian society in terms of the caste system?
Certainly. I am coming to that shortly, but before I talk about the census and the problems that the census enumerators were facing in this classification of Indian society into caste groups or jati groups, it is important to look at the synchronism between the census, which was 1871-72, which is the first census, and an act that was passed called the Indian Criminal Tribes and Caste Act. So you can see how occupation, ethnological research, and certain qualities which are looked upon as attributes of different groups, they are being tied together. So you have certain people in the Indian society belonging to the lower caste who have criminal propensities. So you have the Lodhas in Midnapur, for example, who are identified as a criminal tribe. You have Thugis who are identified as a criminal caste. So the Criminal Tribes and Caste Act were attaching a viceful nature, criminal nature to a certain group. So once again, there is a clear attempt by these ethnologists and officials and census enumerators to attach qualities of virtue and vice to the different groups that they were enumerating, or different groups they were studying as components of the Indian social order. The problem, as you rightly pointed out, was faced by the census. When they went to enumerate, they found that the Varna Pratha or the Varna system had no relevance. So they tried with many classificatory principles. For example, in 1891 census, the Census Commissioner Plowden suggested five-fold classification. You have Brahmin, ritually superior caste, some caste who are powerful but not ritually superior, you have low castes, and you have the aboriginals who are on the margin of the caste society. Some of the tribal groups who had acquired certain features of Brahminical cultures, they are on the margin of the caste society. So Plowden was suggesting a five-fold classification. There was the census commissioner in Bengal, Bodenhall, who suggested that this was not practicable, because if you follow this particular principle, then certain groups who were otherwise very powerful, who had otherwise had been commanding respect, would be clubbed together with people whom they look upon as their inferiors. So the man who was actually managing the census on the ground was facing the same problem, the old problem of how to figure or how to place caste in the map of Indian society. So the person who was responsible for Bengal's census suggested that you have to have a more elaborate system of classification in order to fit the myriad divisions, the complex layers that existed in Indian society. So to sum up, once the census operations began, and the census basically was the basic source of information for all of these ethnological surveys that followed Risley's intervention in this discussion about the caste system by Europeans. The enumerators go to the field. It's a kind of field research that sociologists do. They come up with data which the ethnologists or the great scholars, the ethnologists like Risley were using. So they are facing this problem, but ultimately they resolved it by classifying the population in terms of those numerous jatis. And once that classification was made, in the early part of the 20th century, it became a political interest as well, which is a different story. You know, in the past, relatively inferior castes tried to move up in the social hierarchy by getting a certificate from a Brahmin. Many of these upwardly mobile peasant castes would trace their lineage from a Brahmin ancestor. For example, the term, some of these will claim that they are offsprings of the union between a Kshatriya ruler and a Shudra woman, Shudra Mahishi. So they are claiming a superior ritual status, and in consonance with the kind of material power that these caste groups, some of the upwardly mobile caste groups, had acquired. They could acquire it by trade, they could acquire it by extension of cultivation, in which they were providing leadership, new lands were reclaimed, and in those new lands they were establishing themselves as powerful cultivating groups. So such men who became materially rich, who became more powerful materially, were claiming superior status, just in the same way as Rajputs had done in the past. The manner in which some of these caste groups were forming their own associations and moving away from mainstream nationalism. But that's another story. The caste system in the manner they did, but there was a kind of political intention behind it. So when you come to the census operations, you see it ultimately emerging as the motives became very clear. So this is basically the question we are trying to address in this discussion. Now, the British perception about the caste system in India evolved through stages. The early British observers, whether they were officials or non-officials, scholars or missionaries, they understood the caste system in terms of the original Brahminical textual classification in terms of varnas. So you may remember that famous passage in Bhagavad Gita where the God, Krishna, proclaimed this discussion, we are going to talk about the caste system as it was perceived by the British rulers, more prominently from the second half of the 19th century, but claiming that it is I who have created the four varnas. Choturvarnang maya srishtang guna karma vibhagasha. I have divided society into four varnas depending on the quality of each of these varnas. The Brahmins were expected to teach, to cultivate knowledge. The Kshatriyas were the warrior castes. The Vaishyas were traders, and the Shudras were agriculturists and servants. So James Mill suggested that the Varna classification was one of the earliest Brahminical statement about division of labor. But Varna was not an adequate classification, although shastric, although sanctioned by Brahminical textual knowledge, on which basis the early British Orientalist scholars were looking upon caste as a continuation of that ancient Varna system. Varna was overlaid by a more complex system known as the Jati system.
Sir, how did the Europeans come to term with such a large number of Jati system?
Yes, because this is an important question to the degree that coming to terms with the Jati system is basically moving away from the more simplistic but shastric Varna classification. In actuality, Varna became less relevant than Jati because we have enough historical evidence of how a man from an inferior caste in a traditional society could rise up in caste hierarchy or in ritual hierarchy. We know that in Bengal, during the rule of the Senas, the Brahmins were given so much of eminence and power than in earlier times. Already in the early part of the century, certain ideas about the caste system had already been formed in the minds of the British rulers. Some of these rulers were also scholar officials who had a genuine curiosity about the society over which they were ruling. But as we shall see towards the concluding part of this discussion, that it was not intellectual curiosity alone that had created this interest in caste, because caste represented the basic fragmentation of Indian society into numerous small communities who had an acute consciousness of their distinctive exclusive identity, something which was, at least theoretically, antithetical towards the idea of a nation. So it is not intellectual curiosity alone that was actually inspiring these officials to analyze